They won. The greatest superpower in history defeated its greatest enemy without firing a single final missile. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed, capitalism triumphed, and suddenly the United States stood alone at the top of the world. But that's when everything started to go wrong. Because without an ideological enemy to fight, without a clear threat to contain, and without any real limits to its power, the US no longer knew what it was doing. What was once a mission against communism turned into a sequence of improvisations, poorly explained interventions, and senseless wars. The nation that had grown used to operating in defensive mode now needed a new purpose to exist as a global power, and it failed. That's the central thesis of The Mission by Tim Weiner, a book that is not just a historical account, but a deeply uncomfortable mirror. In it, Weiner traces the strategic decline of post-Cold War America, not due to a lack of resources, but due to a lack of direction. The United States won the battle and lost itself in the victory. What remained was a confused empire, reacting to the world with brute force but without vision, stumbling into crises of its own making, dragging both allies and enemies into a game no one understood anymore. And now, decades later, the question remains, what exactly was the US trying to do? What was, after all, its mission? Or perhaps there never was one. Before diving into the failures of the world's most powerful nation, it's essential to understand who's leading the investigation. And Tim Weiner is not just another political commentator. He's a war reporter, fighting against institutionalized deception. An investigative journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner, and National Book Award recipient, Weiner has spent decades digging through the most sensitive archives of the United States. His previous books, Legacy of Ashes and Enemies, exposed the inner workings of the CIA and FBI with a level of courage few authors dared, and even fewer survived politically to tell the tale. But Weiner's strength isn't just in what he reveals, it's in how he reveals it. He doesn't deal in speculation or loosely cited anonymous sources. He builds his work on declassified documents, direct interviews with CIA agents, seasoned diplomats, national security advisors, retired generals. He reconstructs the puzzle from the inside and shows us in detail where the real decisions were made, far from the spotlight, behind closed doors. In The Mission, he goes even further, not just recounting the mistakes, but exposing how the very structure of American power has become incapable of learning from them. This book is a dossier, an X-ray of arrogance disguised as authority, a strategic autopsy of an empire bleeding from within without even realizing it. And if you've made it this far, it's because you don't accept easy answers, because you understand the world isn't binary, and that questioning power is a duty, not a rebellion. This is Sheffer Vision, a channel that doesn't offer comfort, it offers clarity. And if that provokes you, challenges you, and awakens something in you, then you're in the right place. Now, let's get to what really matters. How the United States, after conquering the world, completely lost control of it. At the moment of victory, America lost its mission. This sentence by Tim Weiner is more than just a provocation. It's the starting point of a geopolitical tragedy. For over 4 decades, the United States knew exactly what it was doing, containing the spread of communism, isolating Soviet influence, protecting its allies, and promoting its political, economic, and military model. The Cold War gave the American empire something invaluable: a purpose, a clear enemy, a mobilizing narrative, a justification for every military base, every act of espionage, every funded coup. But when the Berlin Wall fell and the USSR disappeared, what followed wasn't a new strategy. It was a vacuum. A black hole at the center of the American mission. And that vacuum was filled with something far more dangerous than communism: improvisation. Presidents began conducting foreign policy like political marketing. Generals with no clear oversight gained autonomy to define what counted as war and what was merely a special operation. The CIA began to act on instinct, creating enemies where none existed, intervening in cultures it didn't understand, with no plan, no direction, no accountability. The State Department lost relevance. The White House became a crisis management center, not a strategic command. The US government, long accustomed to operating within a binary logic, now stumbled through a multipolar, fragmented world, one with no fixed rules, no instruction manual. Tim Weiner shows through documents and first-hand accounts that this strategic blindness wasn't an isolated mistake. It became a new institutional culture. The empire that had won the greatest ideological battle of the 20th century entered the 21st not knowing what to defend, what to attack, what to build. And in a desperate attempt to maintain its relevance, the United States began inventing missions. Missions not grounded in local realities, nor in clear objectives, nor in any coherent national interest. Missions that existed more to keep the war machine running than to achieve any form of peace. Missions that even their architects couldn't explain. And so, a historic victory turned into a silent collapse. Not a visible collapse, with tanks rolling into Washington or flags burning in front of the UN, but a collapse of purpose, of direction, of strategic honesty. And that failure didn't stay in the past. It echoed through the next 30 years, in every poorly planned war, every failed intervention, every fabricated enemy. The empire won, but without a mission, every empire becomes a disoriented giant. And that's when it starts to stumble over its own boots. If victory in the Cold War left the United States without direction, the response that followed wasn't reconstruction, it was occupation. The first attempt to fill that strategic void with brute force happened in 2003 in Iraq. And there, the world witnessed how the most powerful nation on the planet could wield its military might without truly understanding what it was doing. There was no real threat, no clear plan, no truth, only a narrative. A carefully crafted fable by the Bush administration to justify the invasion of a sovereign nation. The official story claimed that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, that he posed an imminent danger to the world, that he had direct ties to the 9/11 attacks, and most of all, that the United States had a moral duty to liberate the Iraqi people from tyranny. All of it was a lie. Tim Weiner meticulously exposes how American intelligence was manipulated from the start. The CIA wasn't just misled, it was complicit. It accepted accounts from unreliable defectors. It relied heavily on an informant codenamed Curveball, a man who not only lied, but fabricated an entire fantasy, sold as absolute truth in the halls of power. As Weiner writes, intelligence was politicized, shaped to fit a decision that had already been made. In other words, the data didn't lead to war. The war was already decided. The data was manufactured to support it. The Iraq invasion was, at its core, a war of narrative. And like every effective political narrative, it needed a clear villain, a helpless victim, and a heroic savior. Saddam was cast as an existential threat, the Iraqi people as hostages awaiting rescue, and the US, of course, as the liberating agent, the beacon of Western civilization. But as American troops crossed the border, they encountered a nation that did not want to be saved in that way. They met resistance, chaos, insurgency. They overthrew a dictator but had no idea what to put in his place. And as always, the occupation plan was just as improvised as the justification that gave birth to it. What followed was even darker. Torture practices at Abu Ghraib, secret prisons, civilians killed by poorly aimed airstrikes, a war that promised peace but delivered destruction. What began as a mission of liberation became a factory of instability. The vacuum left by Saddam was filled by militias, civil war, and violent sectarianism, none of which the US understood. And from that chaos, the Islamic State would later emerge, a far more radical, decentralized enemy that could never have existed without the disorder created by America. In the end, what the US exported to Iraq wasn't democracy, it was confusion, it was despair, it was death. And it all started with an official lie, neatly packaged, sold with conviction, fueled by a complicit media, and accepted by a population traumatized by the attacks of September 11th. The mission that was supposed to restore world order did the opposite. It shattered global trust in American leadership. And worse, it left permanent scars in a region already bearing centuries of open wounds. The Iraq War wasn't just a mistake. It was a turning point. The moment the world realized the empire had no brakes, and that the void left by the Cold War was being filled with arrogance, misinformation, and violence.
It was supposed to be a response. It was supposed to be an act of justice. It was supposed to be quick. In 2001, shortly after the 9/11 attacks, the United States launched a military operation in Afghanistan. The declared goal was to eliminate al-Qaeda, capture Osama bin Laden, and destroy the Taliban regime that had sheltered him. And in the first few months, it seemed the mission was being accomplished. The Taliban was overthrown, bin Laden fled, the terrorist infrastructure was fragmented. But then, the US stayed, and kept staying, for a year, then 2, then 5, then 10. In the end, it was 20 years. 20 years of war, occupation, failed reconstruction, and shifting promises that changed with every new president. First, it was about security, then about democracy, then about gender equality, then about military training, then no one really knew anymore. Tim Weiner describes this process with surgical coldness. He doesn't romanticize the occupation. He doesn't try to salvage reputations. On the contrary, he exposes the war in Afghanistan for what it truly was: a foretold strategic tragedy. As he writes, it was a war without a clear definition of victory, and therefore impossible to win. The failure wasn't just military. It was political, institutional, and above all, psychological. No administration wanted to be the first to admit the mission had failed. George W. Bush launched the war, believing he could reshape the Middle East. Barack Obama inherited it and tried to soften it with speeches. Donald Trump promised to end it, but hesitated. And Joe Biden, in the end, was the man who turned off the lights and took the blame for a failure that had been written nearly 2 decades earlier. The cost? 20 years. Over $2 trillion, 170,000 dead, including civilians, soldiers, and fighters, thousands of amputees, orphans, widows, and refugees. And in the end, the image that sealed America's defeat wasn't a flag planted in Kabul. It was a plane taking off with people clinging to the landing gear, trying to escape a country the US had promised to liberate, but ultimately abandoned. The Taliban returned to power stronger, more organized, and more untouchable than ever. The promised democracy was never rooted in real ground. Afghan society, which had put its hopes in Western promises, was left at the mercy of fear, once again. And for the entire world, it became clear, just as Weiner makes explicit in his book, the American mission in Afghanistan didn't fail at the end. It was doomed from the start, because no one truly knew what they were trying to achieve. This was the longest war in US history, and it ended the way it began: in darkness, in haste, and in improvisation. Because having power is not enough. You need purpose. And without purpose, no victory lasts.
If American power seemed invincible from the outside, on the inside, it was a minefield. A war machine that didn't speak the same language, that operated with conflicting objectives, and that, in Tim Weiner's words, fought as many internal battles as external ones. The mission reveals, with surgical precision, what many suspected but few could prove. The United States' main security and diplomacy agencies, the CIA, the Pentagon, and the State Department, were not working together. They were competing. They were sabotaging each other. The CIA, often acting like an independent republic, withheld information, carried out clandestine operations without coordinating with other branches of government, and made decisions based more on impulse than strategy. Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo weren't accidents. They were symptoms, signs of an agency that had become detached from any sense of institutional ethics or diplomatic responsibility, a machine of action, but blind. The Pentagon, in turn, operated with a brutally industrial logic. Its goals were defined by numbers: tons of bombs dropped, terrorists killed, billion-dollar contracts signed with private contractors. But what couldn't be measured, like the social fabric destroyed, the political chaos unleashed, or the civilian trauma spreading like wildfire, was simply ignored. The focus was to eliminate the enemy, not to understand the terrain. It was a war of metrics, not of meaning. And the State Department, the most diplomatic branch, the most cautious, the one most willing to engage in dialogue, was simply left out, ignored, undermined. For years, American diplomats were the last to know about military plans, and the first to be blamed when things went wrong. There was no integration, only competition. And as Weiner shows, this institutional division sabotaged every American mission before it even began. The wars weren't just external, he writes. They were wars between departments, between advisors, between competing truths within the government itself. And here lies one of the book's harshest revelations. The enemy of the American mission wasn't just foreign. It was in the hallways of the White House, in the CIA's briefing rooms, in the reports that never reached the right desks, in the arrogance of leaders more interested in winning internal battles than in understanding the world they sought to control. Each agency acted as if it were fighting its own war. And the consequence was a silent collapse, not from lack of power, but from an excess of ego. When an empire fragments its own centers of decision-making, it doesn't need foreign enemies to fail. It implodes from within. And that's exactly what happened to US foreign policy. While they fought for control at home, they lost it abroad. While the United States waged long wars in the Middle East, a series of smaller but equally disastrous conflicts were unfolding elsewhere. The mission exposes how American foreign policy, even far from the spotlight of Afghanistan and Iraq, continued to be driven by the same logic: force before intelligence, rhetorical idealism before pragmatism, intervention without understanding. In Latin America, the American mission was painted in the colors of freedom. But behind that discourse, what took place were decades of support for brutal dictatorships, death squads trained on US soil, CIA-backed coups, and a doctrine of stability that in practice meant repression. In the name of fighting communism, the US funded authoritarian regimes that tortured, censored, and massacred civilian populations. From El Salvador to Argentina, from Chile to Brazil, the empire claimed to defend democracy, while systematically dismantling any genuine attempt at local self-determination. In Iran, the story repeated itself in a different form. The US backed Shah Reza Pahlavi with money, weapons, and propaganda, ignoring the systematic abuses of his regime. When the Islamic Revolution erupted in 1979, Washington was caught off guard. Not because the Iranian people were unpredictable, but because American diplomacy was blind to its own narrative of control. By investing everything in an unpopular and oppressive regime, the US sowed the seeds for a new enemy, the Shiite theocracy led by Khomeini. The result? An entire nation became a symbol of anti-American resistance, and the Middle East gained yet another unstable piece on its geopolitical chessboard.
In Russia, the era was of a different kind, but no less serious. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States saw an opportunity to shape Russia's future in its own image. Instead of supporting a slow, organic, democratic transition, it went all in on Boris Yeltsin, a weak, alcoholic president deeply entangled in corruption. While Washington celebrated its, quote, partnership with the new Russia, end quote, the Russian people sank into misery, unemployment, and social chaos. It was in that vacuum that Vladimir Putin emerged, a former KGB agent promising order, pride, and revenge. A man who had watched firsthand how the US destabilized Russia and who swore it would never happen again. In all these cases, Weiner reveals a disturbing pattern. The US exported political models without understanding the ground they were planting them on. It ignored culture, history, and internal dynamics. It treated countries like game boards and their people as secondary variables. The consequences were predictable. Every attempt at control sparked resistance. Every civilizing mission created monsters. And every failure eroded a bit more of America's global credibility. The most troubling part? None of this was a secret. Analysts warned, local diplomats wrote reports, but the imperial logic remained untouched. They don't know what's best for them. We do. And it is precisely this arrogance, repeated like a mantra, that Weiner exposes so clearly. Because the greatest threat to American global influence was never terrorism or communism or Islamism. It was the inability to listen, to understand, to respect. By trying to mold the world in its own image, the United States only reinforced global rejection of its presence. It fed the very enemies who challenge it today. And all of it was done in the name of a mission that no one ever managed to clearly define. Of all the uncomfortable truths revealed in the mission, perhaps the hardest to swallow and the most dangerous of all is this. The greatest illusion of the United States lies not in its weapons, its intelligence data, or its strategic reports. It lies in the belief that it is, by nature, different, superior, morally destined to lead the world. The myth of American exceptionalism is old, but in the years following the Cold War victory, it turned into religion, an unquestionable doctrine. The US didn't just see itself as the defender of freedom, it saw itself as the only nation capable of defining what freedom meant. And any external resistance to its plans was automatically interpreted as ignorance, malice, or threat. Tim Weiner dismantles this fantasy with brutal elegance. He shows that the American mission, over the past few decades, has been a series of poorly calculated moral expeditions. Missions not born from a real-world analysis, but from internal projections, idealized expectations, and absolute beliefs. The result was always the same. Failure, frustration, and an escalation of conflicts that could have been avoided if listening had come before imposition. Arrogance killed more than ignorance. That phrase, delivered by Weiner with surgical precision, sums up not only the book's content, but also the ethical collapse of a superpower that forgot how to learn. In the name of high ideals, the United States invaded countries that had not asked for help, overthrew governments that posed no direct threat, planted rootless democracies, and expected the fruits of freedom to grow where only ruins remained. The problem was never a lack of resources, it was a lack of self-criticism, a refusal to admit that the original mission, to contain tyranny and protect liberty, had morphed into something else. Into control, into projection, into a geopolitical messianism disguised as pragmatism.
Weiner doesn't claim the US has done no good in the world. He acknowledges the transformative power this nation has exercised at crucial moments in history. But he also identifies the turning point, the moment when the United States stopped acting with strategic humility and began operating under a logic of manifest destiny, as if its worldview were universal, eternal, and beyond question. And that is the most dangerous lie of all, because it turns any criticism into betrayal, any disagreement into threat, any boundary into something to be broken. The mission ceased to be about protecting freedom and became about imposing a single version of it. And that's when everything began to collapse, not from the outside, but from within. Because when you believe you're always right, that's exactly when you start to lose. In the end, the title of the book reveals its cruelest irony. The mission is not about a real mission. It's about the absence of one, about a promise that was never fulfilled, because in truth, it was never clearly planned. The American mission existed in speeches, in political marketing, in press conferences, in flags raised to the sound of patriotic anthems. But on the battlefield, in embassies, in decision rooms, and on streets destroyed by poorly explained wars, it never truly materialized. What Weiner reveals through documents, testimonies, and decades of investigation is that the United States spent the past few decades reacting, not planning, improvising, not building, entering wars without knowing how to exit them, trying to solve problems they didn't understand with tools that didn't work. Fragile leadership, agencies and conflict, inflated egos, and blind faith in their own rhetoric created a vicious cycle, an empire constantly at war, but never with a real objective. And here, it's important to be fair to Weiner's diagnosis. He does not claim that America is the evil of the world. He doesn't turn the United States into an absolute villain. What he says is something even more disturbing. That America lost itself, lost its compass, lost its humility, lost its sense of limits, lost its ability to listen. And by ignoring the complexity of the world, its cultures, its histories, its internal dynamics, it turned regional crises into global catastrophes. The mission was never clear because there was never a mission. There was reaction, there was ambition, there was fear, there was arrogance. But there was no cohesive long-term project, no alignment between values and actions. And an empire that acts this way is always on the verge of collapse, not at the hands of its enemies, but by the very contradictions it carries within. The Mission is a book about power, but also about loss. It's about what happens when a powerful nation stops asking why and begins acting purely on reflex. And the question that lingers after so many wars, so many deaths, so many mistakes is brutal in its simplicity. Who, after all, defined this mission? Or perhaps it never existed.
By the time you reach the final page of the mission, there's no doubt left. The greatest enemy of American power was never the Taliban, nor Saddam, nor Putin, nor the Castro brothers. The greatest enemy was always inside the government, inside the agencies, inside the imperial logic that replaced strategy with ego, that traded planning for improvisation, that confused strength with wisdom. Tim Weiner makes it clear that the collapse of America's global leadership was not caused by isolated military failures, but by a moral, political, and institutional breakdown centered in Washington. Decisions were made without debate, without review, without long-term vision, often without even considering the consequences, all in the name of a mission that at its core never existed, just the urge to appear strong, to maintain hegemony, to be remembered in history, even without understanding the present. That institutional arrogance came at a high cost. It cost lives, it cost billions, it cost credibility. It cost the respect the United States once held and now must fight to regain. But that redemption won't come through more tanks, more drones, or more aircraft carriers. It will come through something far more difficult, especially for a nation that has always believed it was the exception to the rule. It will come through self-criticism. Because leading the world is not just about projecting power. It's about recognizing limits, understanding cultures, listening to what's being said outside your own echo chamber, knowing when to stop, when to change, when to go silent in order to hear. As Weiner writes on the final page of the book, without a mission, America doesn't lead, it stumbles, and the world pays the price. If the United States wants to lead again, it must start from within. It must rebuild the mission, or, for the first time, truly define it. And if you've made it this far, you already know what that means. Here, we don't settle for easy answers. We dig, we question, we confront, because only those who stare into the abyss can point the way out.
This is Sheffer Vision. It's not about destroying myths. It's about understanding why they were born and what happens when the lie becomes state policy. If this content made sense to you, like, share, comment, and follow the channel. And above all, keep questioning, because the next empire to stumble may already be in the making.